The rhythmic hum of the coffee machine was the only sound in the quiet house as Helen started her day. At 54, her mornings were predictable. A cup of black coffee, a glance at the headlines, and the familiar silence that had become her constant companion. Widowed for nearly a decade, her days passed in a blur of routine. The grocery store trip every Tuesday afternoon was her only regular outing, a chore more than anything else. It was on one of these uneventful afternoons that Helen first saw him. She was examining a display of oranges, wondering which ones were ripe, when a warm voice broke through her thoughts. "Those look pretty good. Better than last week's batch." Startled, she glanced up. The man standing beside her looked to be in his early 30s, with a kind smile and dark eyes that seemed to hold a world of stories. His jeans were slightly frayed, his shirt casual but neat. He wasn't striking in a conventional way, but there was something about him, an openness, a vitality, that drew her attention. Helen offered a polite smile. "Thanks for the tip. I can never tell with these." He chuckled. "It's a gamble, isn't it? I'm Mark, by the way." He extended a hand, and she hesitated before taking it, feeling the warmth of his grip. "Helen," she replied, suddenly aware of the faint blush rising to her cheeks. For the next few minutes, they chatted about fruit, the unpredictability of grocery store produce, and the weather. It was small talk, nothing remarkable, but Helen found herself smiling more than she had in weeks. When he walked away, pushing his cart down the cereal aisle, she felt an odd sense of loss, as if a small flame had been extinguished. As she finished her shopping, Helen found herself glancing down the aisles, hoping to catch another glimpse of him. She chastised herself for the foolishness. What did it matter? He was just a stranger in a grocery store. Yet, as she loaded her bags into the trunk of her car, she realized that for the first time in years, something had shifted. A tiny spark had flickered in her otherwise predictable day. As Helen drove home, the encounter replayed in her mind. She told herself it was nothing, just a pleasant conversation with a friendly stranger. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Something about Mark had awakened a part of her she thought had long gone dormant. For the first time in years, Helen felt alive. The following week, Helen returned to the grocery store, her heart heavier with anticipation than her shopping list. She told herself it was silly. There was no guarantee she'd see him again. And yet, she found herself lingering in the produce section, scanning the aisles for a familiar face. "Back to try your luck with the oranges." The voice startled her, but when she turned, her heart lifted. There he was, Mark, standing a few feet away, holding a bag of apples and wearing that same easy smile. Helen couldn't help but laugh. "You caught me. Let me guess. You're here to supervise my choices again." Mark shrugged playfully. "Someone's got to. You seemed skeptical last time." They fell into conversation as naturally as they had the week before. This time, the talk extended beyond fruit. Mark told her about his job as a graphic designer, his love for hiking, and his attempts at cooking, a work in progress, he admitted. Helen found herself sharing more about her own life than she intended, her love of gardening, her late husband, and her small but cherished circle of friends. Before she knew it, they were walking side by side through the store, comparing favorite snacks and debating the merits of canned soup versus homemade. By the time they reached the checkout line, Helen's cart was fuller than usual, and so was her heart. When Mark asked if she wanted to grab a coffee at the shop across the street, she hesitated for a moment. It felt impulsive, out of character. But then she looked at him, his expression open and genuine, and she found herself nodding. The coffee shop was warm and inviting, and their conversation flowed easily. Helen learned that Mark had moved to town a year ago and was still getting his bearings. He asked about her life with genuine curiosity, listening intently as she spoke. His laughter was infectious, his energy magnetic. For the first time in years, Helen felt seen, truly seen, and it was exhilarating. When they parted ways, Mark gave her a wave and said, "Same time next week?" Helen's smile lingered long after she'd driven home. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years, buoyed by the realization that her predictable routine had been disrupted in the best possible way. Mark had brought something new into her life, a sense of connection she hadn't realized she'd been missing. As she unpacked her groceries, Helen caught herself humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years. It was as if her soul, dormant for so long, had started to stir. The days leading up to her next grocery trip felt both agonizingly slow and oddly thrilling. Helen couldn't remember the last time she'd looked forward to something this much. She busied herself with tasks around the house, trying to quell the nervous energy that had taken up residence in her chest. When Friday arrived, she found herself spending more time than usual getting ready. She dismissed it as vanity, just a desire to look put together. Yet, as she smoothed her blouse and dabbed on a hint of lipstick, a part of her acknowledged the truth. She hoped Mark would notice her. When she arrived at the store, Mark was already there, leaning casually against a display of cereal boxes. His face lit up when he saw her, and the warmth in his smile sent a flutter through her chest. "Hey there," he said, his voice as easy as ever. "Thought you might have switched shopping days on me." Helen laughed, the sound more nervous than she intended. "I'm a creature of habit, remember." Their routine quickly resumed. They wandered the aisles together, exchanging stories and jokes as they shopped. But this time, Helen was acutely aware of small details she hadn't noticed before. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the confidence in his stride, the way he listened so intently when she spoke. After they checked out, Mark suggested another coffee. This time, Helen didn't hesitate. They settled into their favorite corner of the cafe, and the conversation drifted to more personal topics. Mark shared stories about his travels, his family, and his hopes for the future. Helen found herself opening up about her late husband in a way she hadn't with anyone in years, not with sadness, but with fondness and honesty. As Mark talked, Helen caught herself studying his features. The strong line of his jaw, the unruly wave of his hair, the ease with which he carried himself. It struck her, like a sudden clap of thunder, that she was drawn to him in a way that went far beyond friendship. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. She tried to push the thought away, telling herself it was a fleeting crush, nothing more. But the way her heart raced when he leaned closer, the way her cheeks warmed under his gaze, these weren't feelings she could ignore. When they said their goodbyes that day, Mark touched her arm briefly, a simple gesture that left her skin tingling. Helen stood there for a moment after he'd left, her shopping bags forgotten in her hands. The world seemed sharper, brighter, as if her senses had awakened from a long slumber. Driving home, Helen couldn't shake the thought. What am I doing? She was a woman in her 50s, a widow with a quiet life. Mark was younger, vibrant, with a world of possibilities ahead of him. What could he possibly see in her? Yet, as she parked her car and carried her groceries inside, another thought whispered in the back of her mind, a hope she hadn't dared to feel in years. What if this was something real? Helen spent the following days in a whirlwind of emotions she could barely contain. Her thoughts were consumed by Mark, the way he laughed, the way he listened, the way he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. Yet, with every rush of excitement came an equally powerful wave of doubt. Sitting by the window in her living room, she cradled a cup of tea, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the floor. Her mind replayed their moments together. His easy smile, the warmth in his voice, the way he seemed genuinely interested in her life. She felt like a teenager again, but the thrill of infatuation was tangled with uncertainty. What would people think? She wondered. Society didn't look kindly on relationships like this, especially when the woman was older. She imagined the whispers, the judgmental stares, the assumptions that she was chasing youth or trying to cling to something long gone. The voice of reason, the one she'd relied on for years to keep her grounded, told her to let it go. Mark was kind and attentive, but surely this was just a passing connection. He was younger, with endless opportunities ahead of him. Why would he be interested in her, a woman who had long settled into the quiet rhythms of middle age? But then, there was that other voice, softer but insistent. Why not? It asked. Why not allow herself to feel this spark, even if it led nowhere? Why not embrace the possibility that her life could hold surprises, even now? Helen sighed, setting her tea aside. The truth was, she'd spent so many years putting her feelings aside, caring for her late husband during his illness, focusing on her work, and settling into the comforting monotony of her days. Mark had disrupted all of that, and she didn't know whether to thank him or resent him for it. When her phone buzzed with a message from him later that evening, her heart leapt before she could stop it. "Hi, Helen. Just thought I'd check in. Hope your day's been good. Let me know if you're up for coffee this weekend. She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. Part of her wanted to say no, to protect herself from whatever this was before it went too far. But another part, a louder, bolder part, refused to let fear dictate her actions. That sounds lovely. Saturday, she typed back, her fingers trembling slightly. The reply came almost immediately. Perfect. Can't wait. Helen set the phone down, her heart pounding in her chest. She'd taken a step forward, however small, and it felt both terrifying and exhilarating. As she prepared for bed that night, she caught her reflection in the mirror. There were lines on her face that hadn't been there a decade ago, a softness around her eyes that spoke of years lived fully. For the first time in a long time, she didn't just see the past written on her features. She saw possibility, a future she hadn't dared to imagine. Saturday morning arrived with a quiet promise in the air, the kind that makes the world feel full of possibility. Helen spent longer than usual preparing for her coffee outing with Mark, fussing over her outfit and carefully applying a touch of makeup. The excitement was undeniable, but so was the undercurrent of nervousness. Their meeting at the cafe felt effortless. They laughed over lattes, the conversation flowing naturally, as if the outside world didn't exist. Mark shared stories about his latest project at work, while Helen found herself opening up about things she hadn't spoken of in years. Her passion for art, her favorite childhood memories, and even the loss of her husband. The hours passed quickly, and as they walked back to their cars, the warmth of his company lingered. But something inside Helen yearned for more, a desire to deepen this connection that had unexpectedly blossomed in her life. Back at home that evening, she sat at the kitchen table, turning the thought over in her mind. The idea of inviting him to her house felt both thrilling and absurd. They were still navigating this unspoken boundary between friendship and something more, and she wasn't sure if taking such a step was wise. But as she looked around her quiet home, filled with the echoes of years gone by, she realized how much she craved to share it with someone who truly saw her. Helen hesitated, her hand hovering over her phone. Would he even say yes? Would it be too forward? She tried to dismiss the idea, but it persisted, tugging at her heart like a stubborn thread. Finally, summoning her courage, she typed out a message. Mark, I've been thinking. Would you like to come by for dinner sometime? I'd love to cook for you. Her finger lingered over the send button. For a moment, she considered deleting it altogether, retreating back into her comfort zone. But she thought of his smile, the way he made her feel seen, and pressed send before she could second-guess herself. The reply came faster than she expected. That sounds amazing. How about Thursday? I'll bring wine. Helen exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her heart raced with anticipation, her mind already spinning with ideas for the evening. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of excitement about sharing a piece of her life, her world, with someone new. The thought terrified her, but it also made her feel alive in a way she hadn't thought possible. As Thursday approached, she planned the evening with a mix of hope and apprehension. She chose her favorite recipes, freshened up the living room, and even set the table with the good china she hadn't used in years. This wasn't just about a meal. It was about opening a door she'd long kept closed. Whatever happened, Helen knew this was a moment she'd remember. Thursday arrived with a quiet elegance, the evening air cool and crisp, carrying with it a sense of anticipation. Helen spent the late afternoon in the kitchen, the familiar sense of garlic and rosemary filling the air as she carefully arranged the table. Each plate was perfectly aligned, the silverware gleaming softly under the light of the dimmed chandelier. She wanted everything to be just right, not for perfection's sake, but because she wanted Mark to feel welcome, to feel special. As the clock ticked toward the time they had agreed upon, Helen's heart quickened with every passing minute. What would tonight be like? She wondered. She had invited him to her home, and yet the boundaries between them still felt uncertain. What began as a simple meeting at the grocery store, a fleeting exchange of words over jars of pasta sauce, had grown into something more, a connection that left her wondering what the next chapter might hold. When the doorbell rang, it startled her, sending a brief flutter of nervousness through her. She smoothed her hands over her skirt, took a steadying breath, and opened the door to find Mark standing there, a bottle of wine in hand and a warm smile on his face. "Evening," he said softly, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. "Hi," she replied, a smile of her own spreading across her face. "Come in, please." He stepped inside, and for a moment, there was nothing but the quiet hum of the evening. No words were necessary. But as they moved toward the table, a comfortable silence wrapped around them, one that didn't feel awkward or forced, but rather like a gentle invitation to something deeper. They sat at the table, and the conversation flowed effortlessly between them, light-hearted banter about the meal, laughter over funny stories from work, and even moments of shared vulnerability about life's challenges. Mark listened intently, and Helen found herself opening up more than she had anticipated. There was something about him, his genuine interest, the way he made her feel seen, not just as the woman she was now, but as the woman she used to be, full of dreams and untold stories. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere between them shifted. It was no longer just about food and conversation. It was about connection, about the unspoken bond that had grown between them since that first accidental meeting at the grocery store. Helen felt something in her chest stir, a tenderness that was both exhilarating and unsettling. There was a moment when Mark reached across the table to refill her wine glass. His hand brushed against hers, and in that fleeting contact, a surge of warmth spread through her. She looked up into his eyes, and for a second, the rest of the world fell away. It was as if they were the only two people in the room. Two souls quietly acknowledging the shift that had been taking place, without the need for words. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice soft but laden with meaning. She didn't know if she was thanking him for the meal, for the evening, or for something more, something intangible but undeniable that was stirring inside her. Mark smiled, his gaze lingering on her. "I should be thanking you. This has been perfect." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Helen could have sworn she saw a flicker of something more in his eyes. But she quickly pushed the thought aside, fearful of reading too much into it. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where the conversation grew quieter, more intimate. There was no rush to leave, no pretense of formality. They were simply two people enjoying the unspoken connection they had built, a bond that felt deeper than just a shared meal. As the night wore on, Helen realized that the evening had been more than just dinner. It was a moment of revelation. She had invited Mark into her life, into her home, and he had come, bringing with him not just his presence but something she hadn't expected, a spark of light in a life that had once felt dimmed by routine and solitude. The evening ended too soon, and as he stood to leave, Mark lingered at the door. "Thank you again," he said, his hand resting lightly on the doorframe. "I had a wonderful time." "Me too," Helen whispered, her heart racing at the thought of him leaving. But as he turned to walk away, she felt a strange sense of peace, a quiet understanding between them. This was the beginning of something new, something that neither of them had expected, but both of them now wanted. Helen sat by the window, the soft glow of the lamp beside her casting gentle shadows across the room. The night had grown quiet, the only sound the occasional rustling of leaves as a breeze swept through the trees outside. Her mind wandered, back to the moments with Mark, to the way his smile had made her feel seen, cherished, and alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She thought about the touch of his hand, the way his eyes held hers just a little longer than necessary, as though they were both acknowledging something that had quietly blossomed between them. But then doubt crept in. What does this mean? She wondered. Am I too old for this? The question had plagued her all night, and now it seemed louder, more insistent. Helen had always been practical, had always believed that love was something you simply let happen when it did, something quiet and steady, not rushed or chaotic. But what was this with Mark? She had spent the majority of her life expecting nothing more than routine. She had built a life around the small comforts of solitude, the predictable days, and the absence of passion. But now, with him, everything felt different. Love at her age, was it even possible? Society often whispered that love was for the young, that once you hit a certain age, the opportunities to fall for someone new dwindled. But Mark had shown her that love didn't have an expiration date. It didn't care about numbers or wrinkles, or the years that separated their worlds. He had made her feel beautiful, even desirable, in a way she hadn't dared to dream of in so long. The age gap, an insurmountable obstacle in the eyes of many, felt irrelevant when they were together. She saw it in the way he looked at her, in the way their conversations were filled with mutual respect and curiosity. They shared something genuine, something rare. It wasn't just physical attraction. It was an emotional intimacy that had grown in the small spaces between words, between smiles. Helen thought about the fleeting moments of self-doubt. What will others think? It was an uncomfortable thought, one she didn't want to give voice to, but it lingered nonetheless. What would her friends say? Would they judge her, see her as foolish or naive for giving into feelings she hadn't experienced in so many years? But as she sat in the quiet of her living room, she realized that this was her life. She had spent decades living according to other people's expectations, playing by the rules that others had set for her. She had kept herself hidden, behind walls of responsibility, fear, and caution. But now, she wasn't just existing. She was living. And that was enough. Why should love have rules? She thought. Why should it be confined to any particular stage of life? She had learned so much in her years, had accumulated wisdom and experience. And yet this connection with Mark felt like a new beginning. It wasn't about the past or even the future, it was about the present. It was about being open to something beautiful, even if it didn't look the way society said it should. She had finally understood that age was just a number and love was not bound by time. As the night stretched on, Helen closed her eyes and allowed herself to reflect on all that had changed. The loneliness that had once defined her life now seemed distant, like a faded photograph. In its place was a warmth, a flicker of hope that had begun to grow and expand, filling the spaces where doubt had once resided. Love, it seemed, had arrived late in her life, but it had arrived nonetheless. And she was not going to let it slip away just because it didn't conform to the expectations of the world around her. For the first time in a long while, Helen allowed herself to imagine what the future could hold. Not just the quiet days of routine, but moments of connection, of passion, of shared joy. And for the first time, she felt the possibility of something even greater. That love could still surprise her, could still awaken her even now. The fear she had felt earlier melted into acceptance, and a small smile tugged at the corners of her lips. Love, no matter the age, was still worth it the next morning, as Helen sipped her coffee by the window. The sun's first rays filtered through the blinds, casting a soft glow over her small kitchen. The quiet of the morning was different now. It felt more expansive, more alive, and for the first time in a long while, she wasn't rushing through her day, trying to keep the emptiness at bay. Helen thought about the power of love, the way it didn't ask for permission or follow a set path. Love had come into her life unexpectedly, and though it had startled her, it had also opened doors she hadn't realized she'd closed. She wasn't afraid anymore. She had lived through enough to know that love was never about the perfect timing or the right circumstances. It was simply about the choice to be open to it when it came. And now, she was learning to embrace it, to trust in its presence, even if it was wrapped in unexpected forms. Mark had shown her the beauty of spontaneity, of discovering someone new when she thought she was past such things. He had reminded her that the heart doesn't know age. It only knows connection, shared moments, and the joy of being seen and understood. Her time with him had been a revelation, a chance to rediscover the parts of herself she had long buried under the weight of routine and resignation. She thought about the societal judgments that had once seemed so powerful, the whispers, the sideways glances. But now those voices felt distant. They were no longer her concern. What mattered was how she felt when she was with him, the way he made her feel young again, alive again. They shared a bond that was theirs alone, unaffected by the outside world. Helen took a deep breath, her heart light. She had spent too many years living for others, her children, her friends, society's expectations. Now, she was finally living for herself, letting herself feel, letting herself love, without fear or apology. She smiled softly, knowing that the future was uncertain, and yet full of promise. Whatever happened, she had learned that it was never too late for love to find its way into your heart, no matter how old you were, no matter who you were. Helen had embraced this unexpected chapter, and in doing so, she had reclaimed something precious, her ability to live fully, to love without restraint, to trust that the heart, no matter how old, still had room for new beginnings. And as she finished her coffee, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next because love, in all its forms, was something she would never turn away from again.